Hey everybody, and welcome to DnD Horror Stories with DnD Doge. In today's video, we have a story about a player that leaves a Dungeons & Dragons game due to disagreements, and then has the Dungeon Master stalk them online because of it. A story about a player new to D&D that gets targeted right away when they join a campaign by another player, and much more. But before we get into those, if you enjoy what I do here, I hope you consider dropping the video a like, as it does help the channel out a lot. If not for me, then how about for Luna? She's such a good kitty. But with that said, let's get into some D&D horror stories. Trouble with now ex-GM and a problem player. Now they're stalking me. By Reddit user Mondelli747. Hello everyone. This is a bit of a lengthy post, so grab your popcorn and a drink for this one. For simplicity's sake, we'll call the GM, and the problem player, the problem. So to start, I joined a game some months ago, in which a relative was involved as another player. Being close to this relative as I was, I opted to join the group as a fifth player if they needed one. The problems, however, began before I joined, back when it was simply my relative, two other players, the problem, who was a friend of the Game Master, and the Game Master. My relative was playing as a guard of a small powerful city-state. At the start, some guards from the city-state were sent to investigate a pirate ship that had crashed ashore nearby, and after a week of not returning, my relative and his fellow players were tasked to look into their disappearance. Almost immediately, the problems began as, after defeating some zombies that aren't too important to the story, the problem player wanted to take some of the city guards' armor and weapons for themselves. My relative was against this, citing that the equipment belonged to the city. A back and forth ensued between them that eventually led to an argument exploding between them, the first of many. My relative eventually just took the equipment as instructed and forcefully moved the group along so they could get back on track. After saving one of the daughters of the city's noble family, the group returned where, upon reporting what went down, the Game Master, as the nobleman's wife, scolded my relative's player character for sparking the argument and being in the wrong, even though it had already been established that the equipment was city property, and city property was not for sale unless otherwise permitted. A few sessions later, after some combat within the city with some cultists and drunken antics with some of the players, my relative's player character was punished for their earlier actions by being forced to venture out with the party to learn, quote, teamwork. The problem, however, never saw any consequences for attempting to steal the equipment from the dead city soldiers, nor when she went against both the party's and the noble family's wishes about not magically infusing a magic egg they had found with the zombies. All the while, they were all in the same room. All of that alone took place in 3 sessions. After a few more sessions, the tension seemingly died down for a time, which is when I eventually joined the group 2 months into their campaign. As time progressed, things seemingly got worse and worse. Any disagreement, difference of opinion, or otherwise anything not in line with what the problem wanted to focus on was met with being called a dumbass. Primarily to my relative, but also occasionally one of the other players. To make a very long story a bit shorter, I'll give a summarized set of examples the problem would continue to do without any repercussion of any sort from any authority figure over time. Threaten the lives of NPCs, or to even kill members of their family. Attacked my relative's player character after they said they were hugging their backpack tight in order to stop the problem's familiar from rifling through it. The problem said that their player character believed my relative's player character was going to attack their familiar, punched a guard captain in anger, and being told that everything was okay, with no further action taken. During all of this, the Game Master would give no repercussion to this behavior. When my relative and I brought this up with them, they stated that they had a discussion with the problem, and that the problem would work on improving their attitude, which never actually ended up happening. On top of that, there were serious signs of favoritism between the Game Master and their problem player friend. The friend was permitted to wear armor they were not proficient in, and cast spells without any issues. Once again, had no repercussions to any of the threats or actual violence they undertook, etc. On the other hand, my relative was constantly being stopped from doing various things they wanted to do, had their subclass nerfed, and the cherry on top was told that they could not use their extra attacks as part of their action surge. They were playing a fighter. Do note, the Game Master and problem player stated that they had been playing D&D 5th edition for over 4 to 5 years. Remember this. All these problems eventually boiled over when we undertook a mission to help defend a druid village from a cult of Tiamat and subsequent dragon attack. The dragon in question was a young blue dragon. However, its health was increased to 450, which, for those of you who don't know, is 30 HP less than an ancient blue dragon, and spammed its breath weapon attack, believing Dragon's Breath worked by using it for 5 to 6 rounds before needing to be recharged. During that combat, my relative and I would continue to inform her that this was indeed not the case, due to the fact that we are getting hammered by it over and over again, which eventually led to the problem player screaming out to simply let it be. After the horrific combat, my relative had had enough with the constant arguing and screaming from the problem player, and the various other issues I've outlined with them and the Game Master, and left. Yeah, at that point, with the blatant favoritism, the nerfing of OP's relatives' class abilities, and the constant arguing, leaving was probably the best option at that point, as they did try to talk to the Game Master, but nothing came from it. This is where it gets worse. I stuck around for a few more months, hoping everything would calm down. Biggest mistake. Whilst, indeed, some things would turn calm, the favoritism, aggression against the NPCs with no retaliation, and name-calling would continue. After putting up with this for those few extra months, I decided to say my piece about the problem player and left the server near the end of last year. This leads us to now. I've begun to notice a certain pattern when I have tried to join a few games, in which they've ended up with someone slandering my relative and I to the Dungeon Master. Very few people knew about our relation, and even then, we rarely joined the same games. However, the slander mentioned the both of us, and considering the fact that this game was the only one we had been together in within the past year, it quickly became obvious what was going on. I know the Game Master and problem player will most likely read this, and may leave a comment trying to slew things against this post, or even make their own horror story post in response to this one. While I admit I wasn't a saint of a player, I did my best to remain neutral and keep my head down for most things that took place. As with the subreddit guidelines, I won't reveal who the Game Master and problem player are on here, but I know their Reddit accounts, and they know mine, and I know they're stalking me and trying to sabotage me from being able to join other games, even after 2.5 months when I had left theirs. So that's my story. Here's hoping I will be able to continue to move on without their toxic personalities following me. We'll see. Especially now that I'm coming out with my experience, and they're watching my profile. TLDR, I joined a game where the Game Master and problem player were friends, which led to no repercussions to any of the problem player's actions, while a relative of mine continued to be nerfed, or the game master refused to allow them to do various things within their class capabilities. After leaving their game, they're now stalking my relative and I's accounts, and are attempting to sabotage any chance at us joining new games to move on. Well, it's one thing to be kinda salty about players leaving a game that they weren't jiving with, but it's kind of obsessive and psychotic to stalk OP and their relatives' accounts, and trying to sabotage them from joining other games afterward. Now, I know there is always two sides to any story, but I'm inclined to believe OP in this instance, because only 10 minutes after they posted this story, one of the players from the game OP left posted a comment trying to paint OP in a bad light. That tells me that they are indeed stalking his account, and probably have notifications turned on for whenever OP posts or replies to something on Reddit, like posting an r/looking for game, for instance. My advice to OP here would be to make a new Reddit account and then start looking for games, as all evidence points to that player and the GM are indeed trying to slander OP from getting into any other games. Though, what would you all suggest OP do? Let's move on. Am I the a-hole? Player tries to play OP character during ongoing game at local game store. By Reddit user BigMark1507. Some context is necessary before I begin the story proper. For the last couple of months, my local game store has hosted bi-weekly drop-in sessions for Phandelver and below. We typically have a solid group of core players show up every time, and one of these players happened to have his character die during an encounter, so they rolled up a new character for this week's session. Not a problem. However, our local game store games use the point buy system so that players can be balanced and no one comes to the table with an overpowered character. That's not the case here. A player in a group, and one who has frequently played in every game that the store hosts, decided that it was best for them to bring a character where they had rolled their stats. I noticed this was odd looking at their character sheet, which included a positive bonus to every stat and a 20 wisdom, which under point buy rules is impossible at 5th level. The highest possible score is a 19 after racial bonuses. I pointed this out to them, and they brushed it off as if they were in a hurry and just decided to roll their stats. They corrected their wisdom, but left the other stats the way they were before they spoke to the dungeon master about it and corrected the other scores. So, am I the a-hole for pointing this out, or should I have let them play their character? An aside, this player also has a habit of rolling a dice before declaring that they would like to do something, and will load a good dice roll in order to succeed. I feel like I am nitpicking, but this is something that I have noticed and never gets addressed. No, I would say OP is not the a-hole here. That player was definitely trying to pull one over on the other players and the dungeon master by rolling up a character with those stats when everyone else was relegated to point buy. And I would say that it was on purpose, if this player rolling dice before calling what it was rolled for is any indication. If anything, the dungeon master should be the one to catch these things by looking over players' character sheets before introducing a new player character, and should be the one to call out the player for rolling the way he does. Heck, players shouldn't roll for anything unless the dungeon master asks them to. I don't think OP is nitpicking in any way here, though what do y'all think? On to the next one. First time campaign derailed by aggressive player. By Reddit user Lucavia at work. This happened a while back, but it was basically the first and only horror story that I have ever had while tabletop gaming. So, when I was in high school, my best friend invited me to an ongoing campaign that he was DMing for his local friends. I was pretty well acquainted with the three of them by this point, and we figured this could be a pretty enjoyable experience for everyone involved, as they all had quite a few campaigns under their belt. But this would be the first time I ever played D&D with anyone, or any tabletop RPG for that matter. My friend did a private intro session with me to sort of coach me in proper etiquette and to give me the basics, and we all thought that my addition to their campaign was looking to be fun for everyone involved. My character was a snarky halfling rogue who was a thief by necessity, but he had dreams of becoming a dancer and winning the heart of many a fair maiden. My dungeon master's idea to get me into the party was to have me hide amongst the adventuring party to escape the guards after I got caught stealing. He had checked this idea over with his friends beforehand, and all of them said that they were fine with it. But the second we played out the scene, one of his friends, who was playing a lawful neutral fighter, immediately turned my character into the guards, stating to the dungeon master that his character would never party with someone like my character, and that this was, quote, what my character would do. My dungeon master and I both were a little caught off guard by this, especially since we had already asked this player if this was okay, and he had given his consent at that time. But the dungeon master quickly recovered and crafted some story about how I was conscripted to help the party at the local lord's behest. I played my character as friendly and non-combative with the party as I could, but every attempt to push the narrative forward, our fighter would just derail the party discussions to start berating my character again. Our first night of adventuring, I offered to keep watch first, as I had the best rolls for it, and our fighter refuses to sleep and gives me a lengthy in-character threat about how he can't stand thieves and is going to kill my character the first chance he gets. The next morning, we go shopping for supplies, and my character ends up being 2 gold short of what he needs to buy for his gear, so he asks the fighter for money, as the fighter was our designated treasurer, so he had the majority of the party's money. The fighter refuses and threatens my character again. Considering the situation, I thought it'd be fitting and in character to just pickpocket the money I needed off the fighter, and I rolled to do so. I nat 20'd the roll, and my dungeon master explains how I was so deft with my pickpocketing that not a single person noticed, and how, since I was the only one who still had anything to buy, no one was going to suspect anything until later. I was pretty proud of this, and the rest of the table all starts having a chuckle about it, except for our fighter, who stands up and loudly announces to the table that, quote, my character shouts, just so everyone knows, if I catch any of you stealing my gold, I will kill you here and now, with absolutely no provocation whatsoever. My dungeon master stops the campaign to explain to him how, quote, you didn't catch him. You have no reason to suspect that that even happened. To which the fighter player just starts trying to justify how his character would just intuitively know. My dungeon master eventually gives up, exasperated as the argument is going nowhere, and he just wants to move the campaign along already. And our fighter immediately stands up again and says, quote, I start counting my gold. My dungeon master sighs and tells him that he's short 2 gold, and the fighter, without any provocation, attacks my character. I'm still in my starting gear, as this was the reason we were shopping in the first place. I fail my dodge roll, and I get murdered by the fighter before the other players get a chance to intervene, and the fighter then refuses to allow the other players to resurrect me. By this point, the other players are uncomfortable, and everyone just starts agreeing that it's getting late and that we should probably stop here. We end that session and just never pick up that campaign again. I ask my friend if I did something wrong or if I made a mistake in playing my character, and he just tells me that he's utterly confused why his friend just started acting like that out of the blue. He tells me later that he confronted that player, and they just stood by their earlier claim of, "I was just doing what my character would do." I still play with this dungeon master and his other friends quite frequently, and I've never had another incident of this type since. But ever since that game, the rest of the table started inviting that other player to less and less games, and everyone started to stop hanging out with him as much. I sometimes think back on that first ever session, and how that came so close to me almost never trying D&D ever again, because I spent that whole week wondering if I was just not welcome in that space. So much has changed since then, and I'm honestly so happy that my dungeon master and best friend fought so hard to make sure that that was a space I was welcome in, and made sure such behavior never happened again. But dang, if that wasn't the worst RPG experience I've ever had. Yeah, that is a bit odd for the fighter player to say that he was okay with OP coming in as a new player, and with that backstory, and then turned super aggressive towards OP after they joined the campaign. Perhaps the fighter player just wasn't actually okay with adding another player to the game, but instead of saying as much, decided to not go against the grain of the other players saying that they were okay with it, and thinking that getting rid of him in-game was the way to go. Or perhaps the fighter player just didn't like OP for some reason, and that is why he was so aggressive towards them. Either way, that is a real dick move to do to a new player that is joining your gaming group, especially to someone who has never played Dungeons & Dragons before. Now, the Dungeon Master could have stopped this by stating that that wasn't cool for a fighter to do. Or heck, just have the shop owner that OP was trying to buy from haggle the price down a bit. I mean, it was just 2 gold pieces. Thankfully though, it sounds like the Dungeon Master was able to convince OP to give D&D another shot, and prevent them from never trying it again. So at least, there's a bit of a happy ending there. Let's move on. Player tries to get me to stop another player using Skaven Speech for a Ratfolk character. By Reddit user Arcanus Ultra. I was dungeon mastering a Pathfinder 1st edition game, and one player made a Ratfolk character. The Ratfolk player had recently played Warhammer on Xbox, and thought that using the speech style for his Ratfolk would be an interesting way to flavor the world. I agreed, especially since Ratfolk is not one singular culture. Anyone adding roleplay style and quirks is always helpful, I say. So when the player voiced the character, he spoke like that. Quote, "We will win, win, you will die, die." Well, another player got really annoyed at this. He repeatedly told the Ratfolk player to stop it, that Ratfolk didn't talk like that. Since there's no set rule for how, quote, Ratfolk or anyone talk, the Ratfolk player and I told him that it didn't matter. The other player took such issue that he pulled me aside outside of the game and asked me to tell the Ratfolk player to stop talking like that. I asked him why, and once again, his first excuse was, quote, "Ratfolk don't talk like that." I said, well, they can. Maybe some do. I like the flavor it adds to the game. Then he said, "It's annoying." I get that some roleplay quirks can be annoying. I wasn't annoyed at this one at the time, but I felt annoyed at some people's roleplay choices. However, I think I'd rather play with more style and quirkiness than not. It gets boring when every character in the world has the same accent. Edit. Many people in the comments have asked 2 questions, so I'll answer here. 1. Ratfolk player only spoke in that fashion while in character, and after the complaints, he even toned it down, to the point where they remained quiet most of the time, and only used the voice a few times a session. And 2. No other player took offense with it, especially with how much Ratfolk player limited its use, and most even said that they enjoyed the flavor that it added. Now, I could understand how someone talking like that could get a bit annoying, but the player only did it when he was role-playing the character, and like OP said, even toned it down a bit. As OP and the rest of the players didn't mind it, or even enjoyed the flavor it added, I would say that the player that doesn't like it may need to pull a stick out of somewhere and get over it. If it really bothered them that much, he could always find another game to play in. But that's just my 2 cents. What are your thoughts on this one? But that is all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may your games remain horror story free. Until next time.